When we think of ancient Rome, we often picture grand battles, powerful leaders, and big buildings. But behind all of these achievements were many slaves working tirelessly to achieve the goals of their masters, often in tough conditions. These slaves did everything, from managing households and building roads to fighting as gladiators, basically everything their masters told them to do. And if they didn't do it, they had to fear severe punishment. Now imagine a world where these slaves got to switch places with their masters, the same masters that forced them to do the heavy work for years and treated them worse than livestock. Imagine that the slaves were the ones that were in charge and their masters had to do as they were told. What might sound like a crazy idea to some of you actually happened during a festival called Saturnalia, a strange time when everything was turned upside down. And let me tell you, some slaves took some horrifying revenge on their masters for exploiting them for years. But that wasn't the only time slaves stood up to their masters. Throughout Romans history, there have been multiple moments when the suppressed rage and desire for vengeance of the slaves burst out. Welcome to Past Perspectives, and in this video, we are going to take a look at what happened when the slaves had enough of years of suppression and decided that enough is enough. We're going to uncover the horrifying things Roman slaves did to their masters when they had the opportunity to do so. But before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss another topic that has never even been talked about in history class. Slavery in ancient Rome had a long tradition that is deeply rooted in the history and growth of the empire. From its early days as a small city-state to its peak as a huge empire, Rome's success was not just built on the back of its emperors and battles they have fought. It was mainly built on the backs of countless slaves. These slaves came from all corners of the empire, captured in wars, bought in markets, or born in servitude. And while their origins varied, they shared a common story of hardship and subjugation. Just by looking at the sheer number of slaves in Rome, it was staggering. It's estimated that at certain points in Roman history, up to a third of the population were slaves. Historians estimate that during the 1st century AD, somewhere between 5 and 10 million people were enslaved, and they were everywhere, playing crucial roles in almost every aspect of Roman life. In the grand villas of the wealthy, slaves served as cooks, cleaners, and personal attendants. In the countryside, they worked in the fields, taking care of the crops and livestock. In the heart of Rome, they worked as craftsmen, entertainers, and even teachers. And in the arenas where they fought as gladiators, with their lives put on the line just for the entertainment of the masses. And as you can imagine, the life as a slave was far from easy. Even for those who had relatively easy tasks compared to others, their lives were filled with hardships. Many of them faced harsh conditions, especially those who worked in mines or on large farming estates. They faced long hours, working from sunrise to sunset, with no days off and the constant threat of punishment if they didn't meet their quotas or if they tried to rebel. At the same time, they were often subjected to physical harm and constantly lived in the fear of being sold, and being separated from loved ones was a constant threat. To keep the incredibly huge slave population in check, Roman society had a set of roles and norms. Basically, they were defined in a way that masters had total control over their slaves, which in the eyes of the law made them property, not people. They could be bought, sold, or even killed by their masters without any legal consequences. At the same time, slaves were also prohibited from having any legal marriage known as connubium, which means any relationships or families that were formed by slaves were not recognized by law, and any children they had were also considered as slaves and could therefore also be sold. Another example was the actio detignum, which was basically an insurance for the master if the slave damaged another person's property. The master had then the option to either hand over the slave to the injured party or pay for the damages. As you can imagine, most masters simply gave up the slaves. And when it comes to court, slaves basically also had no rights, and they would even be punished if they have done nothing wrong. See, if there was a crime committed in a household, slaves could be tortured to provide evidence or testimonies on that case. This was based on the belief that slaves were more likely to tell the truth under torture. At the same time, any act of rebellion or acting against their masters was met with swift and brutal punishment. So you can definitely see that the entire system was built so slaves had as little room for revolt as possible, and to constantly remind slaves of their place in Roman society. However, Despite these oppressive conditions, slaves were not always just passive victims. They found ways to resist, both in small circles against their masters and in more organized forms of rebellion. To further suppress any ideas of rebellion, at one point Romans came up with the idea of a role switch during the so-called Saturnalia. The Saturnalia was a festival dedicated to the god Saturn, and it marked the end of the agricultural year. Originally, Saturnalia came from older farming rituals, but over the years it evolved into one of the most anticipated events in the Roman calendar, especially for slaves, as it was a complete upending of societal norms. While most historians believe that this role change acted as some sort of release valve to prevent any rebellions, there are more opinions on that. Others believe that it had religious origins and that Saturn, the god of agriculture, wealth, and time, wanted to see everyone, regardless of their social class, living in equality. Another theory was that it simply was a sign to show equality. But regardless of the reason, at this time of the year, slaves and their masters were seen as equals, which was a huge cut in the Roman society as they usually had a very rigid class system. During this time, slaves were not only freed from their usual duties, but were also allowed to assume the roles of their masters. They got to wear clothes of the free men, sat at the head of the dining table, and were served delicacies by their masters. At the same time, they could voice complaints, mock their superiors, and indulge in luxuries, which were typically reserved for elite. As you can imagine, a lot of slaves used this situation not just to live like their masters, but to have brutal revenge. During this time, there are reports of slaves waiting for situations in which they would be alone with their masters and then kill them for all the atrocities the masters committed against them. However, the stakes for this were high, as any slave that would kill his master would also be brutally executed by Roman government, and therefore this came at a huge risk. Other slaves got their revenge in a more subtle way, and they poisoned the food of their masters because they knew this wouldn't be as obvious as killing them themselves. And then there were other slaves that tried to run away from slavery during that time, trying not to be free for just a couple of days, but forever. Now, don't get this wrong. Even though a lot of slaves had deep grudges against their masters, most didn't do this because they were fearful of the consequences and paying with their own life for it. However, during the later stages of the Roman Empire, these situations happened over and over again, bringing it to the attention of the ones in charge. Therefore, the Saturnalia were abandoned completely at one point. While there hasn't been one particular reason pointed out on this, and many historians believe that it was because Christianity slowly started to spread. Others believe that they did this because they didn't want to give slaves the feeling of freedom, and along with that, no opportunity in an uprising against their masters. But this wasn't the only time where slaves started an uprising against their masters and doing horrifying things to them. Throughout Roman history, the oppressed slaves erupted in acts of revenge over and over again. The reason was clear. They were driven by the anger of years of mistreatment and abuse, with the most famous one being Spartacus and the Great Slave Revolt. Born in Thrace, Spartacus was not always a slave. At one point, he was a free man, possibly a soldier, who then found himself enslaved and sold to a gladiatorial training school in Capua. As you can imagine, the conditions in these training schools, known as ludi, were incredibly harsh. Gladiators were trained to fight to the death for the amusement of Roman audiences. Therefore, in 73 BC, fed up with the brutalities they faced on a daily basis, Spartacus, along with another group of fellow gladiators, started a well-thought-out escape. Using makeshift weapons, like kitchen utensils, they fought their way out of the ludi, where they stole wagons of gladiatorial equipment and armor in the process. The gladiators executed all the masters of the ludi on their way out and those who suppressed them for years. Once free, Spartacus took refuge on Mount Vesuvius. The word of their rebellion spread like wildfire and was an inspiration to all slaves. During this time, countless of slaves started to upheal against their masters and brutally killed them. After they escaped, they joined Spartacus, and at one point, historians suggest that his army reached up to 100,000 at its peak. The Roman Senate did initially underestimated the threat of Spartacus and sent militia forces to stop the rebellion. However, for months, Spartacus's forces achieved surprising victories, and they defeated Roman legions and captured even more military equipment. By 72 BC, Spartacus' forces had rampaged through huge parts of southern Italy and even slowly became a threat to Rome. The Roman Senate slowly realized the importance of the situation and dispatched the experienced general Marcus Crassus to deal with the rebellion. Crassus, employing a mix of military strategy and sheer brutality, managed to corner Spartacus and his forces in southern Italy. In a final climactic battle in 71 BC, Spartacus's army was defeated. Spartacus himself is believed to have fallen in this battle, though his body was never identified. Realizing what an inspiration this rebellion could be, the Roman state decided to make an example out of this revolt, and they captured thousands of surviving rebels. In a display of sheer brutality, around 6,000 of them were crucified along the Appian Way, which is the main road leading to Rome. And while this was a horrifying example and revolts like this were rare, this didn't stop slaves from doing horrible things to their masters. One of the most whispered about methods of revenge among slaves was poisoning. Since slaves, particularly the ones who worked in kitchens, had unparalleled access to food and drinks from their masters, this was an easy way to get rid of their masters in a very sneaky way. There are accounts of slaves subtly introducing toxic substances into the meal, which then led to the slow deterioration of the master's health, or even caused immediate death. As I said earlier, this became one of the most popular tactics to get rid of their masters, and since this happened so often, Roman masters became very wary of their meals, and some wealthy Romans even employed food tasters to make sure their meals were safe. Another act of revenge was arson. If we look at the way Roman villas were built, they were extremely vulnerable to fires. Angry slaves who were seeking revenge or simply an opportunity to create chaos as a distraction for escape would often set the estate ablaze. In the middle of the night, when no one could see them, they would start a fire that would often remain unseen until it's too late and the flames were too big. This gave slaves not only the option to take revenge on their masters by burning them alive, as the fire would recognize it too late, it also gave them the opportunity to flee. In some accounts, it was even said that slaves were collaborating in secret, planning the perfect night to set their master's bedroom alight. They would gather combustibles, choose strategic points to ignite, and ensure that the wind direction would spread the fire rapidly. Now, one of the most sinister ways of taking revenge on their masters was assassination. Some slaves, especially those who were close personal attendants, used their closeness to their masters to assassinate them. There are various accounts of how slaves used knives or strangulated their masters to death, and their proximity and trust provided them with the perfect opportunity for this. Others also took their chance to take revenge on the masters were the ones that were responsible for managing equipment, such as wagons. Their knowledge of the process gave them unique insights into how to disrupt this equipment without arousing immediate suspicion. One unique example would be blacksmiths. Their slaves were able to subtly introduce flaws into the crafting process. See, in a blacksmith's forge, just a slight alteration in the mixture of metals or the introduction of impurities could weaken a weapon or tool. Such a tool, when used, might break or malfunction, leading to injuries or even death. On the farmland of Rome, slaves could use other tactics. They were able to mix crops, leading to smaller yields, or they could subtly damage irrigation systems, causing water to either flood the fields or to not reach them at all. These acts would not only damage the immediate harvest, but could also lead to long-term soil damage. As you can see, the slaves had lots of possibilities to take revenge on their masters, and you can be sure that there were countless instances in which they used it. And the longer the Roman Empire existed, the more situations like this came to light. While this was not the main reason why slavery in ancient Rome was stopped, it definitely was a factor. And even though slavery was something that was deeply rooted in human society, at one point it underwent a transformation and eventual decline. Historians believe that the two main factors in this change have been the influence of Christianity and the overall downfall of the Western Roman Empire. If we first take a look at the rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire, it definitely changed the attitudes towards slavery. While the early Christian church did not outright condemn slavery, it introduced the ideas of spiritual equality. See, the idea that all were equal in the eyes of God began to challenge the strict societal norms in ancient Rome. Over time, as Christianity became the dominant religion of the empire, there were increasing calls from the church to treat slaves like humans and even give them their freedom. The second and biggest reason was the downfall of the Western Roman Empire. See, the old structures of Roman society, especially slavery, began to dissolve. The post-Roman world in Europe saw the rise of feudalism, and in this, the concept of serfdom became prevalent. Serfs, like the colonists, were bound to the land and owed labor to their lords. This effectively ended the system of slavery. And while those people still weren't entirely free, they had more rights than slaves. Thank you for joining us today at Past Perspectives as we looked into the horrifying things slaves did to their masters in ancient Rome as an act of revenge. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe to our channel. And with that being said, thanks for watching, and until next time.